Hello vinyl community, this is Mike with TCAT's Deep Vinyl Tracks, and today we're going to do another segment of the King Crimson series that I've been doing. This one is not going to deal with any specific album. We're actually going to talk about their first hiatus, which took place between 1975 and 1981. So during this time, as we talked about on the last segment, the last album King Crimson released was called Red, and that particular album had Robert Fripp a little bit frustrated, because he was starting to complain that he felt like his playing was being drowned out by what he called a flying brick wall. That brick wall being his other two members at the time, which were John Wetton and Bill Bruford. So he was getting a little frustrated, felt like he was losing interest in it, and wanted to basically go out on his own. He said at the time he wanted to quit music altogether, and but as we know, that didn't quite happen exactly that way. But he did go silent for a few years. In the meantime, he wanted King Crimson to continue, but he wanted to be replaced by Ian MacDonald, who had worked with King Crimson previously, and also Steve Hackett, who was with Genesis. So, but there wasn't enough interest in that particular lineup, and so he just ended up disbanding the group altogether, making it official 2 weeks before the release of Red. A lot of people considered it kind of like a publicity stunt, though it wasn't that at all. Fripp said that he was going to quit music altogether. But that didn't happen either. It wasn't long before Robert Fripp was working with other bands, appearing as a guest for bands like Van der Graaf Generator, and also working with Brian Eno, who he had worked with before the actual breakup. And they released, of course, this album called No Pussyfooting. Now, the important thing about this particular album for this time is that Frippertronics was introduced on this particular record, and Robert Fripp would use tape delay and his guitar to make some interesting sounds and everything. Also, Robert Fripp started working with other artists like Peter Gabriel. He worked on Peter Gabriel's first solo album, and also with David Bowie. If you listen to the song Heroes, everybody knows that song, of course. You can hear that unique guitar sound, and that's Robert Fripp coming out that made that particular sound, and that's the use of Frippertronics, so it kind of gives you an idea of where he was heading. He also worked with Daryl Hall on his first solo album, which was called Sacred Songs. Then he started to work on his own solo material. So around 1979, well, actually it was in 1979, he released his first solo album, which was Exposure, which was sort of a concept album, and it showed some new direction. Kind of had a new wave-ish type, post-punk type sound to it, a lot of interesting ingenuity, and not a record that a lot of people were expecting from Robert Fripp as far as his first solo album. But still an interesting album, a great album. I really enjoy it. And so, you know, he used a lot of different artists that he was familiar with, including Peter Gabriel. Daryl Hall sings on a few songs on this, and so on.
Now touch how sweet, how near, how full, why time still, I'm still tonight. Star
so he continued to develop Frippertronics. This originated, of course, like I said, with No Pussyfooting, which was released before the breakup. Also, he continued to work with Peter Gabriel. He worked on his third album with him. Also with David Bowie, he worked on Scary Monsters on that album. And he also worked with other bands, including Blondie on Parallel Lines. He actually guests and plays guitar on the song Fade Away and Radiate. He helped produce and get the band The Roaches signed, and he plays on their first and third album. And, you know, he was doing this kind of work, staying busy, also releasing more of his own material. Also, I wanted to mention he worked with the Talking Heads on the album Fear of Music. But he was releasing his own material, decided to put Frippertronics out there, and he released this album called Under Heavy Manners / Save the Queen. The reason why it's got two titles to this particular album is one side is all about what he calls discotronics, which is Frippertronics with a beat. And he utilizes David Byrne to help sing on one of the tracks, and the second track is a longer instrumental. And on the other side is all just plain Frippertronics. It's just Robert Fripp and his guitar experimenting with the Frippertronics sound. In 1979, he went on to form a band called the League of Gentlemen, which he called an instrumental dance band. But they did release an album in 1980, a year after their formation, and a year after they started touring. And this is a very interesting album. I find it very intriguing. There's some spoken word on here, and there's some music also. And again, he's developing a unique sound as he usually does, and getting his name out there with this album, and also furthering the sound of Frippertronics with the album Let the Power Fall. This one is all completely pure Frippertronics. There's nothing but Robert Fripp playing on this album all the way through. And this one you have to be in the right mood for. Even I have a hard time just sitting down and listening to it. I can put it on as background music, or I can put it on to listen to how Frippertronics was used, and it's a good example. You get a good feel of what Frippertronics is all about on this particular album. But in the meantime, John Wetton, who was the lead singer for King Crimson on previously, and was also the bassist, went on to do his own thing. He toured with Roxy Music and appears on this album Viva, playing the bass. And he also worked on 2 albums by Uriah Heep. Those are Return to Fantasy in 1975 and High and Mighty, which was released in 1976. He tried to form a band that involved Rick Wakeman, and that didn't work out because the record company didn't want Rick Wakeman to be like a second fiddle to somebody else or like a second person in a band. So he went on instead to form UK, the band UK, and he did form that with Bill Bruford, who of course was the drummer for King Crimson. And so they got back together. John Wetton brought in Eddie Jobson from Roxy Music, and Bill Bruford brought in Alan Holdsworth, who he had worked with on a band called Bruford. So UK comes out with their debut album in 1978. Great album. This is probably the closest continuance to Red that's out there right now. But you've got Eddie Jobson's influence with his electric violin and his amazing keyboards on this album. And you got Alan Holdsworth with his interesting guitar styling. It's very unique. You can always tell when Alan Holdsworth is playing because of his style. And there are times when it's hard to tell when it's Eddie Jobson doing his electric violin or Alan Holdsworth doing his guitar, and it just created a really cool sound from this progressive band called UK, a sound that I wish could have continued, but it didn't. Not after they did some touring in that, Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth broke off because they didn't agree with the direction that John Wetton wanted to go on. But Wetton and Eddie Jobson continued on and recruited Terry Bozzio to do drums for the second album, which is called Danger Money. And another great album. It sounds a bit different from the debut album, but you can still tell it's the same band. Still got that great violin from Eddie Jobson. Terry Bozzio is a great percussionist. Of course, he worked with Frank Zappa and several others.
No story to tell about the lessons. Glory just void, empty spaces, nothing to show. No point of reference or place to go. One thing I'd ignored, and so the light came shining
That was released in 1979, and also in 1979 the live album Night After Night was released. At this point, UK broke up altogether, unfortunately. I thought they were a great band. I would like to have heard more from them. So John Wetton went on in 1979 and formed another band called Jackknife. Jackknife is one band that I don't know too much about and can't say too much about, but they released one album which was called I Wish You Would in 1979. In 1981, John Wetton played on Wishbone Ash's album Number the Brave. And in 1982, as most people know, he went on to form Asia, which was a very successful project with Jeff Downes, Steve Howe from Yes, and Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This type of band was more directed towards rock pop, but it kept a progressive edge to it, and kind of was the band that helped push progressive pop out there. So in 1982, they released their debut album, Asia. 1983, they released the album Alpha, and John Wetton continued with them until 1985 with the release of Astra. In the meantime, Bill Bruford wasn't sure which way he wanted to go, and at this point, in 1974, 1975, he became a temporary member of the band Gong. He also worked with Chris Squire on his solo album. Chris Squire, of course, was with the band Yes, and at this time put out a solo album called Fish Out of Water. Bill Bruford is part of that album. And he also went on to work with Roy Harper and Pavlov's Dog. He was on their album At the Sound of a Bell. He also worked with Phil Collins under the band Brand X, which was more of a jazz fusion band. And he also played with the band National Health. In 1976, he toured with Genesis and appears on a couple of their live albums. And in 1977, he released an album under the band called Bruford. And this is the band that he formed with Alan Holdsworth, and this is how he got to know Alan Holdsworth. And he also formed it with Dave Stewart. In 1978, of course, he brings Alan Holdsworth over with him to join the band UK, and like I already mentioned, they left after the release of the first album about a year after, and continued to work on other albums under the name Bruford, one of those being One of a Kind, which was released in 1979, and also the live session album called the Bruford Tapes. And then in 1980, they also released an album called Gradually Going Tornado. He also worked with other bands. Of course, I mentioned he worked with Genesis, and he worked with Steve Howe on his solo album, and also worked with the band that Fripp worked with, the Roaches. So both Robert Fripp and Bill Bruford at this time started to work on and form a new band, which they would call Discipline. And this band called Discipline was going to feature on lead vocals Adrian Belew, and also Tony Levin on bass. Now, Belew in 1979 was discovered in a way by Frank Zappa. He went and auditioned for Frank Zappa a couple of times, and Zappa was so impressed with him that he brought him into his band. And Adrian Belew appears on the album Chic Your Booty by Frank Zappa, and also appears on the live album Baby Snakes.
City of tiny lights, don't you wanna go? Here's a tiny auto horn, where my tiny blow. Tiny
also go on to work with Talking Heads. He appears on the album Remain in Light as kind of a guest guitarist. And he also toured with Talking Heads quite a bit because they loved his guitar antics. They loved the way he could mimic other sounds like elephants or cats or horns honking and things like that. So he toured with Talking Heads for quite a while. Also worked with Jerry Harrison, and they, in fact, when there was some issues between David Byrne and the other members of the Talking Heads, they invited him to take David Byrne's place, to become the new lead singer. And that could have worked out because a lot of times I think Adrian Belew does have kind of that David Byrne sound to his vocals, but Adrian Belew decided not to do that. He turned them down on that and instead went on to form a band called Gaga. He also worked with the Tom Tom Club, which was also kind of a break off of Talking Heads. And he was starting to get quite a reputation because of his guitar playing. So because of that, he was signed on by Island Records to be a solo artist, and he released this album, Lone Rhino, in 1982. Fripp was also starting to notice Adrian Belew because of his work with the Talking Heads and his solo album, and got together with Belew and talked to him about becoming a member of this new band called Discipline as the second guitarist and lead singer. Adrian Belew was quite excited about this, of course, and agreed to it as long as he was able to continue to release solo albums at the same time, which they all agreed to.
And I felt your eyes like a tide pulling me out into the air. Oh, for a moment in time, you held me there. Father and son, home again.
Tony Levin, who would become on as the bassist for Discipline, was also quite a well-known session bassist and worked with a lot of different artists, including Paul Simon on his album Still Crazy After All These Years. He actually appears as bassist for 7 of the tracks on this album. And he also works with Herbie Mann on the Family of Man for the album First Light. And so several other artists. He also worked with several other artists, including Lou Reed for the album Berlin. He worked with Alice Cooper for $1 Billion Babies, and he also played on Peter Gabriel's first album. He would also actually become Peter Gabriel's preferred bassist. He also played on Robert Fripp's solo album Exposure, and that's in 1978, and that's what got Robert Fripp familiar with his style. And he also was a musician on the 1980 release of John Lennon's Double Exposure. He appears on this album on several tracks, and so of course his name was getting out there. Yes, he was invited to come along for the ride, and before the release of Discipline's debut album, all the members got together and decided, this actually sounds like a King Crimson record. So King Crimson was reborn, with Adrian Belew on electric guitar, guitar synthesizer, and lead vocals. Robert Fripp on electric guitar, guitar synthesizer, and other devices. Tony Levin on Chapman stick, bass, and backing vocals, and Bill Bruford on drums and percussion. Now, the thing about Tony Levin is he's famous now for advancing the use of the Chapman stick, and Chapman stick and Tony Levin's name kind of go together a lot, and you will hear this on the new album that will be coming out and that we'll be reviewing on the next episode, which is called Discipline. The title of the album retained the name Discipline, however it would be released under the name King Crimson. So that does it for the first hiatus. I kind of skimmed over a lot of things. There was a lot of material to cover, and of course there's a lot of things left out, but I wanted to kind of hit the highlights between the time that this hiatus was going on. And so that's it for this episode, and the next episode we'll be talking about the album Discipline. Thank you for watching, and we will talk to you later.